When you're thinking about buying into a practice, it's obviously takes a big financial commitment. As a buyer, we'll approach it that way first. Yep. And then we'll talk about the seller. But where do you even begin? Let's just start from the very beginning, the nuts and bolts.
It's probably one of, I joke with ODs that with 3 strokes of a pen, you can be $1 million in debt, right? You buy your house, you have your student loans from optometry school, and then a potential equity buy-in into the practice. Obviously, all 3 of those have different variables. You first have to understand where your money is going before you can tell it what to do. So you have to understand not only from your perspective as to what you're making right now, but what is the practice going to generate for me in revenue, in additional revenue, if I do this buy-in after I buy in? Because I think so many times young ODs, when they're presented with an offer, and this is, again, I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth on both sides of the negotiation table of what a seller is doing and what a buyer is perceiving in that relationship. So many times I've seen where a seller will just say, well, the purchase price to buy into my practice is $450,000. And then they just stop. And as a buyer, you're like, great, I'm paying back $240,000 in student loan. I just bought a $300,000 house, and now you're going to ask me to write a check for $400,000. Yeah, when you do the math, it just doesn't work out that way. And what sellers are missing is presenting the upside potential of what that buy-in is going to do for them. So you have to understand as a buyer the total financial picture of the practice, and I think your seller also needs to be very transparent with you on the financials of the practice, not just what you've made and not just what your production is in the practice, but also what the net income of the practice, what's the return on equity that you're going to be getting in this practice. So you have to understand the full ramifications of that purchase and not just what you're going to have to pay in a monthly debt service.
Right. What would you say are the biggest challenges or hurdles or barriers, whether that is logistically or just psychologically, and maybe it is about I've got so much loan debt already, there's no way I can afford to buy into this practice. It's just impossible.
Sure. So a phrase that I'm fond of saying is cash is king, right? And so I'm not a really big fan of someone just going out and hammering through their student loans, refinancing them on a 5-year or 7-year note, and just saddling themselves with this huge student loan payment. It's admirable that they want to get out of debt. But if they find an opportunity to buy into a practice in between the time that they graduate and when they'd be out of debt, again, from a lending perspective, cash, and I guess I would emphasize cash flow, is king. And so if you've now refinanced yourself into the situation of not having an additional amount of cash flow on a monthly basis because it's all tied up in your student loan payment, from a lending standpoint, when you go to a bank, they're going to see your debt to income ratio is going to be you're going to be redlining that debt to income ratio so much that even if the financials of the practice support it, you're now a higher risk underwriter, or you're now, from an underwriting standpoint, you're now higher risk, and you may lose out on an opportunity to buy a practice. Now, that's not to say that another opportunity might not come down the road, or you can negotiate with the practice that you're looking to buy into, but cash flow is king, and so you want to make sure that A, you have a good nest egg, you have a good, what I would call arrows in the quiver to use for this, and then also make sure that you haven't let lifestyle creep get a hold of you upon graduation, and also that you're not refinancing yourself into a corner from a student loan standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yes, if you go buy a house, right, a lot of times you go get a pre-approval letter first. Yep. You kind of know what you can afford or what you maybe should afford, and you go from there, right? When you're talking about a practice, like, how does that step happen? Is it cart before horse? How does that work? Do you go to the bank first and say, okay, I'm thinking I might want to buy into a practice. What can I afford? What would you loan to me? Or do you take the numbers of the practice, go there first? Or, if, especially straight out of school when you haven't had time to build a nest egg and you don't have all these savings built up.
Sure. I haven't really seen too many situations where you're going to go get pre-approved like you would for a house, because it's all going to be dependent upon the type of practice that you're looking to buy into. And so if you go to a lender and say, I want to buy into a $400,000 practice, well, the equity that's going to be backing that up is the practice itself. It's not, and it could be a variety of different things, and there's so many different moving parts to the practice. A house is a house is a house. We know the value of the house in that location, but there are so many different moving parts in a practice that it's difficult to get a pre-approval letter for that. Rather, figure out and go to the negotiating table with your OD or with the seller of the practice, get a ballpark understanding of what that purchase price is going to be, and then take the financials of the practice to the underwriter as well, so that you can go kind of both hands full. Here's my personal situation. Here's the business and the financials of the practice, and start working with your lender on from that perspective.
Yeah, you touched on going maybe with the owning OD, or at least with their financials. What, as a buyer, and on the flip side as a seller, should you be looking for in the numbers, to know what you need to take to the bank if they're not willing to go with you, or if you're a seller, what do you need to be willing to show that buyer so that they know what they're doing?
Typically, any lender is going to want to see at least 2 years of complete financial statement. So they're going to want to see your balance sheet. They're going to want to see your statement of cash flow, your income statement, 2 years tax returns, just to figure out the health of the practice. That's going to be the staple of where you're going. And then from there, lenders may start peeling back the layers of the onion to look at what's your debt service look like within the practice, what's your EBITDA, which is your earnings before taxes, depreciation, interest, and amortization. So you're going to get deeper into the numbers based off of just kind of that high level layer of looking at what the practice looks like, but that's where you're going to start.
What do you think is oftentimes the biggest disconnect between the valuation? For example, a seller might think their practice is worth this much, and then a buyer thinks, well, I think it's only worth it. Yeah, because I feel like
sellers are completely logical in the valuation of their own practice.
Exactly. So I feel like that's oftentimes a big disconnect. And I mean, why do you think that is? And at the end of the day, who has the final say at the end of the day as to what this practice is worth? Because if you're a practice owner, you've probably grown this practice, you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and you might think it's worth $1 million, when in reality, it might not be worth $1 million.
I think we're seeing a lot of that reality, like the difference between what they think it is and what they actually get for it. I think with more data becoming readily available to ODs, I think that delta is closing. I don't really understand where that happens. The only thing that I can tie it to is just that business is their baby. I mean, my practice was, and my wife and I joke about this all the time, like, my business was our first child. Now, I love it near and dear in a very, very different way than our 2 daughters, but with that emotional connection, that emotional equity, the financial equity, the time, sweat, not blood, but all that investment that I put into it, I think that's a bigger part of where ODs place a higher value, because it is theirs. And on a side note, this is from a management standpoint where you can see a disconnect between partners. One partner was the founding partner, and then the other post buy-in. I've seen situations where the founding partner now gets frustrated that the other partner doesn't have the same drive and the same conviction and the same buy-in to the practice, not literally, but figuratively. And I've always kind of opined that I don't think you can expect them to have that, because it wasn't theirs they didn't start the practice. So I think you're always going to be in a different perspective. I don't know if that answers the full question there. I don't really know if I can tie it down to one thing, but
no, I think there's definitely an emotional intangible that you can't put a money price on, but certainly a lot of sellers try
to.
Right?
Well, and I guess one thing that I would add on to that, founding OD puts a lot of faith in what we would call add backs, right? So they may lease their vehicle, like there's tax advantages to leasing or purchasing a vehicle above a certain weight inside your practice. You can use that in the practice. That's a tax deduction. Healthcare expenses that are run through the practice, personal expenses that are run through the practice, they inherently just kind of build up that additional sense of valuation in the practice because of the perks that they have. And there's been a disconnect in how they communicate that to the buyer. It's just the buyer doesn't know what they don't know. They've never had this conversation before. They've never owned a business. Nowhere in 4 years of optometry school is this ever covered. And so they're going into this not knowing what they don't know, and the seller is kind of expecting them to know it because it's knowledge that they've acquired throughout their entire career.
Yeah, and to that point, when you come out of school, like you said, you haven't run a business, you haven't worked in a real practice. I mean, you may have interned or whatever, but you most likely, unless you just happen to be one of the lucky few, don't have a whole big amount of lump sum money that you can bring to the table, right? So do you have to, or is there other ways of buying into a practice that you're able to roll that in or do different things?
No, you don't have to have equity to buy into a practice. I mean, there are lenders out there, even for a startup practice, that will give you 100% financing out the door. Now, again, we're talking just the practice. If there's any real estate involved, I have yet to see of a situation where you can go in with his 100% financing. Typically, most real estate, if real estate is involved in that transaction, is going to require at least a 10% down payment on the real estate that's holding the practice. But purely from the financials of the practice, no, you can get financing for the practice. And again, this is what comes back to connecting the dots for the buyer of what you're now going to be making versus what debt service you're going to have to service, and do the math on figuring that out, right? When we look at the numbers, the average associate OD salary is what, 125? Give or take geographic location, things like that. Medical model, in a specialty practice, you might start creeping in the 150, 160, 170s. The average return on equity, the average business owner, average optometrist is bringing home about 225 to 230, okay? And that's the average, which means that there are people that are on the lower end, and then there's a lot of practices that are on the higher end of that. We've had a client that is just buying into a practice that it's an OD-MD practice. His buy-in is $400,000, okay? But his net increase in salary, his salary is going up approximately 60%, and the biannual distributions that he's going to pay that $400,000 back in less than 5 years. Mm-hmm. Now, again, he has done all the right things up until this point. He hasn't let lifestyle creep get in the way. He's cash flow positive, right? All of the numbers work out well. But if I were to just present that, or if the current partners were to just present him and say that it's a $400,000 check, and he wouldn't know the other side of that equation, one could very easily see how you'd run the other direction, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to talk a little bit about the selling side of selling the practice, and what the best way to set yourself up for success is in that regard. But before we get there, I almost want to kind of do a case study, so to speak, because I think like examples sometimes really help drive home the point. So I remember whenever I was just starting out, I was probably a year out of school, and I was working at a practice. It was a good practice, been around forever, and the practice owner said, look, here's an opportunity here. I've got to sell this practice. There's some issues, health issues, and he had to sell this practice, and he said, I'd like to offer to you first. And I was only a year out of school. I already I had mountains of student loan debt, of course, and there was real estate involved. Okay. And it was a sort of, well, here's what I'd like to sell the practice for. And then, the building that the practice is in is also going to cost, I think it was something, I forget, over 10 years. At this point, I don't even remember now, but it was like $1 million over, for this big piece of real estate, the practice. And I was like, oh my God, I can't afford this. I was like, there's not a chance.
Fire alarms going off in your head.
It's impossible. Yeah. So, using that as an example, let's just set the stage. You graduate from school, let's just say, and let's just pretend you've got, I don't know, $200,000 worth of student loan debt. That is your student loan debt. You don't own a house yet. Yep. And, you might be renting, maybe wherever you move to, you're renting. You might have some savings in your bank account, probably not that much. Not much. And you get this opportunity to buy into a practice. How do you set yourself up, A, to make the numbers look right in your favor, so to speak, to go to the bank and maybe get this loan to buy in? How do you, what does that process look like for your average kind of graduate that might be a year out of school?
Yep, good question. So one of the, low-hanging fruit things that you would look at is your credit score. And again, being a new grad, maybe you don't have a lot of credit history. Having little credit history is better than having bad credit history. And it just comes down to the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of personal finance. It comes down to stockpiling cash and making sure that you have kind of those arrows in the quiver, so that if you did have to write a check for $50,000 to put down on that piece of real estate, you'd have those funds able to do that. It means making sure that you understand where your money goes. And yes, it's that budget word. I'm not saying that you didn't do that. You obviously did. I don't know that there's any real secret sauce other than for me, the first thing that I would want to do, given your situation, is dive into the numbers of the practice. Because as a buying OD, I would want to, if I'm in your situation in that, and I'm going into it with that entrepreneurial mindset, or maybe not entrepreneurial, but business owner. I think there's a difference between an entrepreneur and a business owner. An entrepreneur is someone that's creating something new, right? Or we're starting from scratch. A business owner, when you buy a business, all you are doing, at its core, buying a business is doing nothing than purchasing the predictability of future cash flow. And so if you buy into a business and you get the financials of the practice, and this is why for sellers out there, you have to be transparent. You have to be transparent with your financials. The 3 things that you must be transparent on: in no particular order, because you're basically your three most important financial statements: statement of cash flow, income statement, balance sheet. Be transparent at least 2 years in arrears, because as a business owner or as a potential business owner, what I'm looking not only at the opportunity right here, but where's the growth potential? If this is a practice that hasn't really adopted the medical model of optometry so much, or maybe there's you know that there are a few cases here and there where you've done some really great work in specialty contact lenses and scleral lenses and things like that, and you enjoy doing that, but there's really not a niche focus into practice, that's additional type of equity that you have the opportunity to potentially build. So, and this is where you want to try and find, okay, I know what I'm purchasing at face value, but what's some of the intrinsic equity? What's some of the, not intrinsic equity, but intrinsic value that I might be able to grow in this practice? And so that's when it comes into, I don't want to say it's you're not showing all your cards, right? Because at its core, buying into a practice is a negotiation. And to your point about what's a fair deal, at the end of the day, now, again, it has to be legal and enforceable, but at the end of the day, a purchase agreement is nothing more than a legal document that's agreed upon between two parties. So if you go into it not only being transparent on the financials, and you can run the math on your own personal, again, you've got the freestanding cash flow, the return on equity from the practice is going to substantiate the debt service payment. As long as you understand the metrics of the practice and there aren't any skeletons in the closet, I don't know that I can blow the lid off anything more than what we than that.
And how do you go about, once you get that loan, say $400,000, and like the person that you mentioned,
Yep.
and he said, he can pay that back in less than 5 years,
Yep.
which is a pretty amazing turnaround.
It is, yep.
How does he do that? Should someone assume that if they're making, say, $150,000, their salary is now going to be $200,000, that $50,000 automatically goes toward paying that off? Or how should they approach the payoff part?
Oh, this is where I can just use the blanket financial planning term. It depends. And it really does. I can't really give a blanket answer. One of the reasons that he's able to pay it back in less than 5 years is for two reasons. Number one, as an ODMD practice, it's an incredibly profitable practice. And so the metrics in the return on equity that he's getting as now being a shareholder is giving him a substantial, not only is he getting a bump in salary, but he's also getting a return on equity. He's also getting that shareholder distribution, which when you compare what he's having to pay versus what he's getting, that significant delta is just freestanding cash flow for him to service the debt. And compounded on top of that, and this is why I preach so much, you cannot let lifestyle creep back you into a corner. You can't. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy a house. I'm not saying that you can't get a new car. I'm saying you don't want to leverage yourself so that you have a great car, but you can't afford to put gas in the tank, right? Don't, and I'm talking in hyperbole there, but if you're in a situation where, let's say, the metrics of the practice and the return on equity that you would get, the shareholder equity, barely leaves you with enough to service the debt, because that could be a situation. Well, now we're back to one of two things, in my opinion, off the cuff here. Number one, do I see intrinsic value in ways in which I can turn around that practice, right? There are ODs that may be watching this or that we all know that have bought a $600,000 practice and in a couple of years turned it into $1 million practice, right? So you can, now, do you have the stomach to do that? Do you have the wherewithal, the drive, the determination, the resources to do that? Because most of those things require what? Money. So you need working capital in order to do those things. So that's number one. The other thing is, do you feel comfortable redlining your practice financials and personal financials such that if anything goes, I don't know if I use the word wrong, but if it doesn't go according to plan, now you're in a situation where you may not be able to service that debt. A lot of what we're talking about here, you just have to know your numbers. There's no excuse for knowing your numbers.
Yeah, let's flip the script for a second, and let's talk about, sometimes we have practice owners that will reach out to us, for example, and they'll say, I'm having a really hard time finding a buyer for my practice, right? And obviously there could be all kinds of different reasons why that might be. But if you're going to go about selling your practice, say you want to sell your practice, what are some things that sellers can do to make their practice more attractive to maybe newer graduates who have less working capital in the beginning? I mean, are there different things, different arrangements they can make, different ways they can help them finance it? I mean, have you heard of sellers doing things to help with this financial hurdle for newer kind of graduates who are just getting out of school with
Sure. I would say one option that they could consider is work on a buy-in. So you work in a certain portion of your earnings go towards purchasing equity in the practice, whether that's an actual formal arrangement or you base, whereas, okay, out of every quarterly distribution, and again, part of that may be based off your production. If you're a straight production and you're getting 17, 18, 19% of production, then you're just going to take some of that and purchase into the practice. Or maybe it's a different type of formality, and this is what is probably what I've seen to be common, where if you're coming into the practice, and let's say you're the owner, okay, and I'm going to buy into your practice. I don't have the capital right now, but I want to buy in. Let me phrase it this way: the worst decision that that I could do is you and I ink an agreement that I'm going to buy your practice in 5 years based off of nothing written in stone right now other than just that statement. And the reason I say it's a really bad decision is that, let's say you're doing $1 million in your practice and I come in and we jump that up to $1.7 million. And then 5 years from now, I've had 5 years to save money, I've got this capital here, I can write a check. You see where I'm going with this already, right? Yeah. So now you, the owner, says, great, Adam, I'm ready to sell my practice. And the valuation is, let's just use the ballpark number, 60% of, not 1 million, 60% of 1.7 million. So what you've in essence done is you're now having to buy part of your practice from yourself. So if you come to an agreement where you're going to buy into a practice, you can ink that kind of post-date that purchase, right? We're going to sign an agreement today that in 5 years, on this day in 5 years, I'm going to buy your practice. But the valuation is going to be based off what the valuation is right now. Now, you may not agree with that. And that's the beauty of negotiations, is that we have the ability to agree or disagree.
So I think that's a great tip for not only sellers, but also buyers, right?
Yep,
I mean,
absolutely.
It applies both ways. I mean, do you have any other top tips, maybe your top 3 tips, just in general, we'll count that as one. If you have 2 other top tips, right, that you can share, you can leave the audience with when it comes to buying into a practice.
So I think the last 2 tips that I would give, one of them is very short, the other one is more long-term. On the short term, be prepared that if you buy into a practice, insurance companies might ask you to collateralize that through insurance, through 2 types of insurance, disability and life insurance, just so that they're made whole in case something happens. So you'll have to figure that potential premium into your personal cash flow analysis. On the long-term side of things, you want to be in practice to not only control your professional quality of life, but also your personal quality of life. And so being a business owner gives you that opportunity to call the shots, right? And do the things that you want to do professionally as well as personally. I have a relationship where there's 3 moms, all own the practice, all work about a day and a half a week. And the beautiful thing about that, you know what they would do if their kids have a field trip coming up in a month and a half? Just tell the staff, hey, block me out, right? It's that the additional intrinsic return on equity that you're getting and being able to control your schedule, set your own schedule, rather than as, quote unquote, just an associate. Guess who's going to be filling in if the owner wants to go on that field trip with Susie, right, with their daughter or whoever it is. So don't think that there's a direct correlation between I'm a practice owner, so I have to be a full-time equivalent. In fact, that's one of the biggest reasons that I see ODs get into practice ownership is so they don't have to be full-time equivalent. And we could do a whole nother panel here on just the return on time that you get. And I would argue that if you own a practice, you should not be working a full-time equivalent because for 2 reasons. Number one, you need time to work on the practice, on the executive and strategic level thinking. And number 2, running a business is really freaking hard. So you need some time off. You need some personal time as well.
When you've done this and you've got all these policies, you've now got equity, is there any way that this all works against you in other purchases that you may be looking at too? So maybe say you want to buy a house after you buy a practice, or you want to do, I'm going to go buy this
like, is that insurance going to work against you?
Well, just all of it, that you're now, you have all of this sort of stuff racked up. You've got a $400,000 investment in a practice, but now it's time you want to buy a house. We've talked about how it works the one way. How does it work the other way in all of this? Is there any negative side to going through that
if the financials of the practice makes sense, it's not going to hurt you. Okay. Because a lender is not going to underwrite something where you can't service the debt. So at the very least, your debt to income ratio is still going to be, I'm not going to say neutral, right? But it's certainly not going to swing the needle in either direction because a lender wouldn't underwrite that loan from the begin with if you didn't have the freestanding cash flow to service it. On the insurance side of things, that has no implication because the relationship that you will have with that policy is directly between you and the lender. It's not related to anything else. Yep.
adding to your tips, are there any big red flags that you would say as a buyer or a seller, but particularly as a buyer, once you get into those financials, that would make you go, maybe this isn't a good idea?
I would want to know and just be observant about what the owner is doing. Like if the owner is the one that's ordering their frames, if the owner is the one that's seeing patients on Saturday, if the owner is the one that's doing everything right now, and that's not what you want to be doing, like those are some of the tasks that should be delegated to an office manager. So you have to think about, okay, if I don't want to be doing this, and in this example, I'm talking about like a complete transition, maybe a complete succession plan, not necessarily as an associate buy-in. But if you're absorbing this practice or you're buying this practice but outright from this doctor, and they're the ones doing all that stuff, guess who's going to be doing that when a transaction closes, unless you go in and change things. And that's where, I guess, to the financials, if you don't want to be the one that's ordering frames at 8 o'clock at night, and you don't want to be the one that's reconciling the books or doing payroll or all the other, what I would call the messy middle of practice ownership, and you want to delegate that to someone else, well, A, do you have someone on your team that you can delegate that to already? And if you don't, now you're going to have to hire someone, which now you've got to figure that into the financial equation as well and rerun the numbers. So I guess I did get to your financial question eventually.
Well, I mean, I know we could talk for hours, Adam. We'll definitely have to do another part 2 of this at Vision Expo
Be happy
East.
to do it.
But in the meantime, you have always served as a wealth of knowledge.
Pun
I know
intended.
you've got a podcast as well.
Yeah.
So, tell the folks where they can tune in and listen to more.
I appreciate that. 2020 Money, if you go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, go to integratedpwm.com. That's our website. Click on Learning Center. You'll get all of our podcast episodes. I think we're at episode 48. And the phrase or kind of the theme of the podcast is it's meant around trying to help ODs solve their problems, solve your problems. It's not a boring financial planning podcast. Yeah, we do sprinkle in some financial planning topics from time to time, but it's primarily about helping ODs through a lot of the problems, many of which we've talked about here today. So 2020 Money, look for that, or you can head to integratedpwm.com and find it under the Learning Center. So thank you.